My name's Philip, and I go to a small private university in Massachusetts. I'm a country boy from Texas, and the only reason I go into this prestigious school was because of a bunch of scholarships that I really had to fight for. It had always been my dream to go to a school like this, a small historical school that you'd see on some teen movie. I knew I was smart enough to do well, but I didn't realize how difficult the social aspect would be. Every time I met a new person, right away, they would instantly know that I was on scholarship. It was like they could tell that I didn't belong here. All the other students were super rich. Many of them were legacies, and they just saw me as some country bumpkin. It wasn't fair. I got a lot of crap from a lot of people, but the worst always came from my roommate, Kevin. Maybe it was because we lived in the same tiny dorm. Maybe it was because he assumed that his roommate's loser reputation would rub off on him. Maybe he was just a jerk. But whatever the reason, he made my life miserable. He never called me by my name. He called me Phil, or Philly, or Philadelphia, which I hated. He always used my stuff without asking. And the day after I went shopping to stock up on food, he went into the refrigerator and threw out half of my new stuff because I'd gotten it at the dollar store, and he didn't want it to infect the organic food that he'd already bought. With how he treated me, you'd think he'd just want to avoid me as much as possible, but that was not the case. He always invited me to the parties that he went to. At first, I thought he was trying to be a good roommate, but I quickly realized that the only reason he wanted me there was so that he could look better in comparison. I was a prop to him. And depending on the people we were around, he either used me to make jokes about what a loser I was, or to make himself look like a better person for befriending someone so much lower than him. And for most of my first semester, I just put up with it. I wasn't really making a lot of friends, so I didn't go to a lot of parties without Kevin's invitation. I made the most of it, but I knew why I was there. I was there to be laughed at. That all changed, though, when Kevin invited me to a party at the Omega Beta Zeta Sorority. It was my first Greek party, and I assumed that it would be epic. When I got there, though, I was surprised by how chill it was. I guess Omega Beta was known as kind of a hippie sorority. New age, free spirit, outdoorsy. And for once, I fit in more than Kevin. Everyone I met asked me questions about my childhood growing up in the desert. They were impressed that I was an Eagle Scout back in high school and that I'd volunteered as a park ranger for a couple of summers. Honestly, it felt great. It felt like my past was finally a benefit instead of the drawback. I ended up really hitting it off with Rebecca, one of the new pledges. She was seriously the most beautiful woman I'd ever seen. I couldn't believe that she was interested in me. We had so much in common. And we ended up leaving the sorority house to just walk around in the quad and talk. We ended up spending most of the night together, and it was magical. When I got home, Kevin was already asleep. But in the morning, he demanded to know what happened to me the night before. I told him that I really hit it off with Rebecca, and he got this insanely jealous look in his eyes. "Rebecca?" he asked. "Rebecca Sanders? She'd never get with a loser like you." I didn't know what to say. That was genuinely one of the meanest things anyone had ever told me. So I just shrugged and walked into my bedroom. The next week, I went out with Rebecca twice. Once to a coffee shop just so we can get to know each other better, and then once to an exclusive nightclub that I'd never been able to enter before. We had so much fun. I was really starting to like her. But every time I saw my roommate, he demanded to know everything that I did with her. He was obsessed. I tried to just ignore his questions, but he wouldn't stop. After I got home from our third date to the on-campus museum, Kevin was waiting for me at our kitchen table. There were a few empty bottles in front of him, so I could tell he was at least a little drunk. He demanded to know what I'd been up to, so I told him. He absolutely freaked out. He jumped out of his chair and flipped the table onto its side. The bottles flew everywhere. "What's your problem, man?" I asked. "You are. Someone like you doesn't deserve Rebecca. And I'm gonna do everything I can to make sure she realizes that. What do you mean? He winked at me. You'll see. Now, of course, I told Rebecca everything. She didn't understand it either. She barely even knew Kevin. I assured her that he was all bark, no bite, but she didn't seem convinced. Honestly, I wasn't convinced either. For the next few weeks, I kept seeing Rebecca, but I always looked around to see if Kevin was nearby. Once, I thought I saw him staring at us in the park, but when I ran over to confront him, he was already gone. Whenever I got back to the dorms, he'd always be completely silent around me. Then, one day, everything changed. He knocked on my bedroom door, a big smile on his face, and asked, "So, do you and Rebecca want to join me and my girlfriend tonight? We're having a game night in the dorms, and I want you both to be here." "What?" I asked. Well, for one thing, I had no idea he had a girlfriend. And for another, he was acting so normal. Clearly, he was up to something. He repeated his offer again, and I said, "Sure, let's do it." So that night, Rebecca and I sat in our dorm living room across from Kevin and this busty blonde named Jessica. Kevin had his arm around Jessica the whole time, but that didn't stop him from staring at Rebecca like a total creep. I asked him what games we were going to play, and he pulled out a single beer bottle. "Spin the bottle," he said. "No," I told him. "Definitely not," Rebecca said. "You better play along," he said, "or I'll get you kicked out of school for attacking me." "What? I never attacked you," I said. Without saying anything, Kevin got out of his chair and walked over to the wall. Then, he slammed his head against the wall, hard. Then he slammed it again. After 3 times, he walked back to his chair and sat. His nose was swollen, and blood streaked down his forehead. "Don't you see what you just did to me?" he asked. "Our school has a zero-tolerance policy toward violence." Then he grabbed the lock of his hair and violently ripped it out of his head. "What the hell?" Rebecca said. I felt the same way. But Jessica didn't react at all. She wrapped her arm around Kevin and kept staring forward. "So," Kevin said,
"Should we start the game now, or do you want to hurt me some more?"
Rebecca pulled out her phone. "I'm calling the police," she said. That was when Jessica finally reacted. She jumped out of her chair and grabbed the phone from Rebecca. "No cops," she said right in Rebecca's face. "Not until I get paid and get out of here." "Do you see what you made me do?" Kevin screamed at me. "You take the only woman I could ever love and I'm forced to hire this crap. This is all your fault." "Love me?" Rebecca shouted. "You don't know anything about me." "Does that matter?" he said. He punched himself right in the eye and then turned towards Jessica. "You'll be my witness, right? You'll tell everyone that he beat me up." She didn't answer.
"Say yes and I'll pay you more."
Jessica dialed 911 on Rebecca's phone.
"Hello," she said. "I'm not going to give you my name, but I've just witnessed an attack."
Then she gave the police my name and dorm number. Then she hung up and set the phone on the table. Kevin gave her a wad of cash and then she left. Kevin just sat there, smiling and waiting for the cops to arrive. "You won't get away with this," Rebecca told him. "I'm a witness too. I'll tell them what really happened." "They're not going to believe you," he said. "I'm the victim here. I'm the one with bruises. And besides, my family owns this town." He looked so sure of himself. 3 minutes later, a policeman arrived. Kevin answered the door and said that he'd just been attacked by an out-of-towner. The policeman started taking down notes. But then he looked over to Rebecca and stopped. "Were you a witness?" he asked. "Yes, Daddy," she said. "And I'll tell you what really happened." Kevin tried to interrupt her, but it was too late. The officer was Rebecca's father, so of course he trusted her. In the end, he took Kevin away in handcuffs. Ever since then, I've had the dorm all to myself. It's awesome. Especially because Rebecca can visit me anytime she wants.
I live in Utah, so most of the families in my neighborhood are Mormon. They're all really friendly, but I'm not part of the church, so I always feel like an outsider. I drink and have tattoos, and even though people are nice to my face, I can tell that most of my neighbors don't really accept me. I don't want to move though, because I have a pretty good job, and it's a beautiful area. I just wish it were easier to make friends. The couple who lived next door were probably the most outwardly mean to me, Seth and Brittany. They were both tall, blonde, and very good looking. Aside from me, they were the only other people in our neighborhood who didn't have any kids. When I first moved in, I figured we'd get along well. Brittany even came over and dropped off a housewarming meatloaf. But almost instantly, I knew they didn't like me. Brittany took one look at the tattoos on my arms and shielded her eyes, as if she'd just seen me naked. I assumed she rushed back to her house and told Seth that the Antichrist had moved in next door, because that evening, I got an email from my new homeowners association listing off all the problems with my house. I knew that Brittany and Seth were the ones who complained about me, and it wasn't even my fault. I just moved in. All the problems with the house existed before I got there. That didn't matter though. Thanks to them, I had to spend hundreds of dollars fixing up my shutters and porch, even though no one had any problems with the house when the previous owner was there. A few weeks later, Seth invited me to their house for a barbecue, and I figured it was their attempt to bury the hatchet. I told him I'd come. It was in the middle of July, so it was very hot. But when I got there, Seth handed me a long sleeve sweater to wear so that no one would have to see my tattoos. I told him point blank that I wasn't going to wear it, and he told me to leave. After that, I heard from our other neighbors that Seth had lied about what happened and told everyone that I'd show up drunk to his house and he had to kick me out before anyone else saw. I tried to let everyone know what really happened, but I was still the outsider. Everyone believed Seth over me. After that, I tried to avoid them. They kept complaining to the homeowners association about me, including all the times I supposedly walked around naked in my own home with all the windows open. That was a lie, of course, but people still didn't believe me. I hated them, I honestly did. And the worst part was that there was nothing I could do about it, until last month when my brother Andrew came for a visit. Andrew is a few years younger than me, and he's always been kind of the wild child in our family. He arrived at my house right when Seth and Brittany were leaving theirs. He took one look at them and his face dropped. It was like he saw a ghost or something. I pulled him inside, and then he instantly burst out laughing. He asked me if those were the neighbors that I always complained about, and I said that they were. They were the perfect golden couple that saw me as the biggest screw-up in the world. Just wait till you see this, he said. He pulled his laptop out of his backpack and connected to my Wi-Fi. Then, he went to his OnlyFans account. I told him that I didn't want to see any of the adult videos that he watched, but that didn't stop him. He clicked on one of the accounts that he followed, and there on his screen, I saw Seth and Brittany dressed up like superheroes. What the hell? I asked. Do they post adult videos online? Nope, he said. That's just it. They don't do anything. That's why I subscribed to their account, because they're so cringe. Here, watch this. He clicked on one of their videos, and I saw Seth and Brittany in their superhero costumes tap dancing to country music. Then he clicked on another video, and I saw them sword fighting with their stuffed animals. The next video showed them talking to the camera about the best way to wash laundry, and the next one was them rubbing each other's feet. Andrew was right. This was the cringiest thing I'd ever seen. It wasn't sexy. It wasn't funny. There was absolutely no reason why they were wearing superhero costumes at all. It was just awful. And they had hundreds of subscribers. I knew I could use this to my advantage, but I also knew that I couldn't just share their OnlyFans link to our other neighbors. No one would click on it. I had to do something more drastic. So that night, I invited Seth and Brittany over to my house for dinner. They didn't want to come, but they were too outwardly polite to say no. As the three of us sat down to eat and Brittany kept complaining about how terrible my food was, Andrew snuck over to their house. Their door was unlocked because no one locks their doors in our neighborhood. He snuck into their bedroom where they filmed most of their videos and started messing with their camera. My brother is kind of an idiot, but he's amazing with technology. He works with audio-visual equipment for his job, so he had all the equipment he needed. It only took him 10 minutes, and then he came back and joined us for the rest of our dinner. The next day, I invited all our neighbors over for a big outdoor barbecue. I scheduled it for 5 o'clock because I knew that was when Seth and Brittany went live for their Friday stream. Because of that, they were the only people in our neighborhood who didn't show up. Everyone else was there. My brother set up a giant projector in my backyard, and once everyone arrived, he turned it on. Instead of streaming directly to OnlyFans, Seth and Brittany's video was projected directly onto my screen. Everyone could see them dressed up in their costumes and rubbing each other's feet. I didn't say anything. I just let the video speak for itself. The entire neighborhood freaked out, but they were all too polite to leave. So we had our barbecue and everyone awkwardly tried to ignore the video that was playing in the background. I don't know who went over to their house first, but someone must have told them about what happened, because that night, Seth came knocking on my door demanding to know what I'd done. All I said was that I found them online and that I was their biggest fan. They moved away a week later. I still haven't made friends with a lot of the other neighbors. They all think I went too far, but that's okay. I can live with that. The other day, my boyfriend Tim complained that whenever we went out to eat, I was the one who always chose the restaurant. I didn't realize I did that, but I guess he was right. So I told him that the next time we go out for dinner, we could go wherever he wanted to go. And do you know where he took me? Hooters. The one restaurant I never expected myself to eat at. Honestly, when he said it, I thought he was joking. But no, he was dead serious. And since I'd already agreed, I couldn't say no. So that Saturday, I came back from my afternoon yoga class and Tim drove us to Hooters. The whole drive there, he talked about how excited he was. He'd always wanted to go. He assured me that the food was good. Whatever, I just wanted to get it over with. When we got there, it didn't seem too bad. There wasn't any line and the building seemed pretty nice. But when we got inside and asked for a table for two, Tim looked around the place and his whole expression changed. I've changed my mind, he said. Let's go somewhere else. No, I told him. We're already here. It's okay, he said. I know you didn't really want to come here. I don't know what caused him to do a total 180, but it didn't matter. We were here, I was hungry, and we were going to eat. The voluptuous hostess took us back to a table near the bar, and we sat down. Tim kept looking around, visibly nervous. I asked him if anything was wrong, and once again, he said that we should go somewhere else. We didn't. We waited there for a couple of minutes until a blonde waitress came up to ask for our drink orders. She seemed friendly, but she barely even looked at me. She focused all her attention on Tim. I assumed that was what the waitresses at Hooters were trained to do. They gave all their attention to the male customers, and they probably got better tips that way. We ordered, and the waitress left. It didn't take long for our drinks to arrive. The waitress gave me my margarita, but when she was handing Tim his beer, she accidentally dropped the bottle right on his lap. His pants were soaked. She kept apologizing, and he just said, it's okay, over and over again. The waitress suggested that Tim go to the bathroom to dry off. They had air dryers in there. Tim thanked her and said he was fine. Just go, I told him. You can't sit here in wet clothes. He tried to think of an excuse, but when he couldn't think of anything, he got up and left. As he was going, he told the waitress to get him another beer. She said that she would, but he wouldn't leave until she walked back to the bar. Obviously, Tim was acting really weird. I had no idea why, but once he was gone, I found out. The waitress hurried back to the table and told me that she'd spilled his beer on purpose. She wanted to talk to me, alone. What's going on? I asked. Your boyfriend and I have been sleeping together for months now, she explained. I'm so sorry. He always said he was single, but I never really believed it. I wasn't going to say anything, but you seem so nice, so I just had to tell you. She was going to say something else, something important, but she saw Tim exit the bathroom and she scurried off. Now, everything made sense. Why he acted so nervous, why he wanted to leave the restaurant as soon as we got here. Tim sat down and asked, Did the waitress come back while you were gone? Not yet, I lied. I think she's still getting your beer. She seems nice, so I hope you're okay if we tip her a lot, even though she spilled on you. He looked at me suspiciously, "Yeah," he said. "That should be fine." The rest of our dinner went pretty smoothly. We got our food, which was delicious by the way, and the waitress treated us like any other customers. Tim was on edge the whole time, but I just pretended like absolutely nothing was wrong. When the bill came, the waitress gave the tray to me. I could tell from her expression that she wanted me to have it. Tim tried to reach for the bill, but I swatted his hand away. "You're such an amazing boyfriend," I told him. "You always treat me so well, and since the restaurant was your choice, I like to treat you." He didn't argue. I looked over the bill, which wasn't too expensive, and then noticed that she'd written something on the back of the customer's copy. Tim was staring at me, so I shoved the customer's copy in my pocket to read it later. As I promised, I gave the woman a very big tip. It wasn't her fault that my boyfriend was a cheating scumbag. As we drove back home, Tim seemed relieved. He was proud of himself for getting through the dinner without being caught. He had no idea that I knew everything. When we got back home, I went to the bathroom to finally read the hidden message on our receipt. It just looked like a bunch of letters and numbers, but I eventually figured out that it was the URL address to some website. I pulled out my phone and typed in the address. I couldn't believe it. It was a address where Tim dressed in different animal costumes and performed all kinds of explicit acts on a bunch of different people, not just the waitress. He was selling these videos, and he didn't go by his own name. He called himself the Stallion. Horrified, I silently left the bathroom, gathered up my stuff, and walked out of the house without saying a word. Tim tried to call me a bunch of times after that, but I didn't answer. I had no idea that one trip to Hooters would make me realize what a disgusting, cheating sleazebag my boyfriend was.
My husband Dave was a businessman. He was a great provider, but I barely saw him. He spent long hours in the office, and about once a month he'd go on business trips all over the country. I loved him more than anything, but after a few years of marriage, he was starting to feel like a stranger. Last summer, he came home one day and said that he'd be gone for a week. He needed to meet with distributors in Missouri. Normally, I wouldn't put up much of a fight, but our anniversary was that week. I didn't want him to be away on our anniversary. I asked him if he could cancel, but he refused. After a bit of arguing, I realized that he'd completely forgotten about our anniversary. I was furious. He said that his secretary Jane was supposed to remind him of important dates, but that wasn't any excuse. He should be able to remember our anniversary without getting help from the office. He hugged me and said he'd make it up to me when he got back. And to show that he meant business, he called his office and told his secretary that she was fired for what she did. He smiled at me as if he'd done something really chivalrous. I was disgusted. I didn't care about his secretary forgetting to remind him. This had nothing to do with her. This was about our marriage and how he didn't take it seriously. So then he called the spa that I really liked and set up an appointment for me on the day of our anniversary. "There," he said. "Is that better?" No, it wasn't, but I was done arguing with him. I pretended to be happy and said, "Yes, dear, I love you." The next Monday, he left for his flight to Missouri. He didn't even wake me up to say goodbye. He just left a note on his side of the bed. I spent that whole day alone in the house, trying to figure out what I was going to do. I didn't want to leave my husband, but I also didn't want to keep living this way. Dave always chose work over me, and I hated that. I invited a few friends over, and we spent the day in the pool. Then Tuesday rolled around. It was our official anniversary. I called the spa and told them to cancel my appointment. I wasn't in the mood to leave the house. I just wanted to stay at home and sort through my feelings. I cooked a bit, cleaned out some of my old dresses from the closet, and watched a couple TV shows. I also drank. A lot. By the time night rolled around, I was pretty drunk, and I still hadn't figured out what I was going to do about my marriage. I guess I dozed off for a bit on the couch, but I woke up to the sound of footsteps coming from behind me. Someone was inside my house. For a second, I thought that Dave had come back home to surprise me. But when I turned around to look, I gasped. Dave's secretary, Jane, was standing behind me. Her face was twisted in an evil grin, and she had a single kitchen knife in her hand. "What are you doing here?" I asked. "Where is he?" she shouted. I assumed she was talking about Dave, so I said, "He's on his business trip. You should know this." She cackled, as if I'd said the dumbest thing in the world. "He doesn't have a business trip. He's probably off visiting Sarah or Monique." I had no idea who Sarah or Monique was. This didn't make any sense. "No," I said. "He's in Missouri." "That jackass would never set foot in Missouri," she said. "He's cheating on me again. For years, I've done everything he's asked me, and what do I get for it? He throws me away like garbage. He fires me over the phone." You've been sleeping with him?" I asked. "Of course!" she screamed. "I've ignored the other women, and I've ignored you, that harpy wife. But now I've had enough." And with that, she dove at me. I couldn't believe it. On one hand, I'd always been suspicious of Dave's long nights in the office, but I told myself that he was a good man, he was loyal. But I guess I was wrong. I stood on the other side of the couch so she couldn't reach me, but she jumped over it and grabbed me by the shirt before I could dive out of the way. She shoved me onto the floor. She was a normal-sized woman, but she was surprisingly strong. Either she spent a lot of time at the gym, or pure rage was making her stronger. She sat on my chest and pressed her forearm into my neck. With one hand, she raised the knife ready to stab me. "Wait!" I choked out. I could barely breathe, but I needed to say something. I needed to reason with her. What have I done? Why are you mad at me?" She laughed again. "I came here to kill him for what he did, but since he's not here, you'll do just fine. The dutiful, oblivious wife. Look at your house. He's given you the world. It's not fair." "Please," I said, "don't you see that we're both victims here?" "Nice try." "Think about it," I said. "He's cheating on both of us. Let's team up." I don't know why I said that. The words just came out. But they seemed to work. Jane stopped pressing against my neck. She still clutched the knife like she was ready to stab me, but she pulled back. "Get off me," I said, "and let's talk." She stood up. I could tell she still didn't trust me, but she was open to listening. She walked over to the couch and sat down. She patted the cushion next to her, inviting me to sit with her. As I joined her, she grabbed my half-finished bottle of wine and started drinking. "No funny business," she said. "If you try to stop me in any way, I will kill you." Once I sat down, I realized that my cell phone was sitting on the cushion right next to me. Making sure that Jane didn't notice, I reached over and turned down the volume. Then, with one hand, I dialed 911. I asked Jane to explain what she planned to do to my husband. And while my phone was connected to the police dispatch, Jane started talking. She admitted to wanting to kill Dave. She talked about how she snuck into the house and was ready to stab him to death. I was very careful with what questions I asked her. I made sure that she admitted to attacking me. I made her list off all the times Dave slept around so that her motivation would be clear. And I even made her say her full name. I kept her talking for a long time, until she finally lost patience. "And will you help me?" she asked. "Will you help me kill him?" I wasn't going to kill anyone, and I definitely wouldn't admit to planning a murder with the police listening in on the phone. But I also couldn't tell her no, because she still had the knife. She could still kill me if I said anything wrong. So I said, "Tell me exactly what you want from me." I figured that was non-committal enough. She started laying out the plan. She said that we could both wait for him to come home. I could greet him on the second floor, and then she could run out and shove him down the stairs. That way, it would look like an accident. And she finished with, "What do you say? Are you in?" At that point, I had no idea what to say. But thankfully, that was the exact moment when the police pushed open the front door and ran inside. Jane tried to put up a fight, but they grabbed her and knocked the knife out of her hand. As they dragged her out of the house, she screamed at me, "How could you? You hate him as much as I do!" "Don't worry," I said. "He'll get what's coming to him." Afterwards, a policeman sat me down and got my full statement. I asked him if they'd recorded the full 911 call. He said that they did. I asked if I could get a copy of the recording. He looked at me strangely, but he said yes. The next day, I took the audio file, cut out the parts where Jane listed off all of Dave's affairs, and sent that recording to all his business contacts. I posted it on his Facebook. Then, I went upstairs and packed all Dave's clothes into a suitcase. By the time he came back home, I told him to get out of the house. We've been going through divorce proceedings ever since. It's not over yet, but it looks like I'll get the house and half his money. Like Jane, I wanted to punish my husband for what he did, but I went about it the right way.
His ruffling pants exposed his presence when he walked up beside me. It was the sound of sleeky iron fabric, the type that was distinguishable by the way it sounded. I looked away from my Big Mac, my eyes falling to his shoes first. The polished pair was impressive, and they glistened as though they had been dipped in a bowl of oil. I trailed up his ankle and the straight cut of his pants, so pristinely ironed I had the sense that the creases would slice open one's hands if they inadvertently ran their finger along the line. I took a deep breath, and this man, as though perceiving my attention was on him, drew his suit tighter on his body to flex the contour of his pants and how well it sat on him. My stomach tugged with envy for his style. He headed straight to the table with 2 empty seats away from me and sat opposite to the man who was dining on fries and a large cup of soda. I noticed the man reacted instinctively at first. He flinched and drew his hands away from the table. The man in the suit, however, continued to speak, words I could not tell because his lips moved fast. A moment passed, and the other man warmed up to the stranger. The stranger offered a handshake, and the dining man took it. It was a strange thing to witness in a McDonald's, but I had enough food and a little entertainment, so I was curious enough to watch the exchange continue. The stranger exposed a suitcase, and the other man's burger fell from his hands. I felt an indescribable feeling when his eyes lit up. My curiosity piqued, and it was with utmost restraint that I remained seated. The stranger pulled out a board, and just as suddenly, a voice broke out from the counter. "Hey, this is a McDonald's establishment, not a kid's park. We don't allow any of that here." The attendant, a red-haired woman, wrinkled and bespectacled, called out. The stranger did not move, and I struggled to maintain my attention on the McDonald's counter and the man who sat on the table with the stranger. The atmosphere turned tense, but there was a stillness around the stranger that made the hair on my forearm stand on edge. The cozy smell of buns did not seem to have its effect once this new air blew into the establishment. It was dusk, and there were 4 of us, complete strangers to each other. Yet this strange man in a suit who I had just found fascinating seemed even stranger. The man opposite him stole glances at me. A furtive look of confusion as the McDonald's attendant started to rail at the defiance. The stranger did not slacken his character until he made the sudden announcement. "I win, you lose." His tone was flat. He stood up to his feet and pulled his arms apart. The man opposite the table kept his eyes on the open suitcase just as I did. He looked straight at me, and I saw the interest in his eyes. My mouth was dry even though I had food and drinks in front of me. I sensed it was my nerves fraying, but it was so terrible, even the taste on my tongue was altered to a coarse tingle. It was like a moment in a dream. I struggled to reconcile the look of betrayal in his eyes when he saw that I did not fully comprehend what he was proposing. "I will collect now," the stranger said, calling both our attention to the fact that he was now standing behind the man. He reached his hands around the man's neck and pulled back what I suspected to be a string. The man's eyes widened in horror, but his scream was cut off before he could utter it. The man's neck simply wobbled, like jelly when the instrument passed into his neck. The skin of his neck remained, but the matter that held his head to his body suddenly appeared to have dissolved. The attendant let out a loud shriek of horror when the stranger shoved the man's head onto the table. The cry rocked my bones with its beastly chill. It was so deep and piercing that it gave depth to the horror I had just been assaulted with. "Who wants to play my game next? There are 2 of you," the man said with an assuredness that made me freeze in fear. His eyes were gauzy, yet pale. His hands were white, almost drained of blood. And when I stared at it long, I soon started to notice the vein strip network etched around the back. I hoped for the floor to open up as an escape from me and the monster in front of me. I could not trust the attendant to not act rationally under panic, and it made me nervous. "You will pay," he said, and my stomach immediately sank. I shook my head, and my fuzzy mind cleared up to observe that he had not pointed at me, but at the attendant behind the counter. She shrieked, hands on her face, which had become red from trauma, and made an attempt to escape from him. He glided across the McDonald's in a steady, unwavering momentum. He did not run, and his march was so hypnotizing, he was almost onto her when I finally snapped out of the transfixation. "I'm calling the cops," I barked, shaking terribly and with no idea where I had dropped my phone. He paid me no mind. Sheer dread made my ears click. He was smiling, and I could sense his grin from where he was. "You will play the game, win or lose," he said to her, and she scrambled around to fetch a knife, but it did nothing to stop his advances at her. Still, she swung her hands to aim at him. I looked back at the body of the man who had just been murdered, and I struggled to make sense of my night at the McDonald's, which had started off with 2 large orders of fries, 1 soda, and 2 burgers. "Stay away," she cried, and her tone was so desperate and so broken. It spurred me into action without thought. I threw myself across the room and towards the counter. She aimed the knife at me, but I was fueled by such a dizzying rush that I snatched the knife from her before I realized I had. "You sick moron," I bawled as I lunged at him, whipping the knife into his neck and twisting it all the way back until it stopped by his shoulder bone. He did not resist me, and it frightened me so much that I recoiled without the knife after I had dug it in. He stopped and scoffed, gasping for breath after a moment as the color of his suit changed to mark the spread of his blood. He fell to his knees with a smile on his face, dying. "You didn't get to play," he mentioned, falling face first into the ground, dead. "Oh my God," the McDonald's attendant cried when she finally regained her senses. "Call the cops." I had just ended a strange man's life, and the horror he had visited upon strangers. I did not have the stomach for questions. I stared at her and jumped over the counter to escape the senseless barbarity I had just experienced. We'd been living in this house for 5 years, and I had never had so much as a glimpse of my next-door neighbor. I was sitting on the front lawn, cross-legged on the grass, my attention half on the daisy chain I was currently stringing together, the other half directed towards the house next door. It was an old 19th century building with tawny-colored bricks and large bay windows that were always covered with old, moth-eaten curtains. Most of the other houses on the street were more modern, making the Victorian-esque design stand out. There was something brooding about the house, something strange and dark that I couldn't quite put my finger on. Everyone had a story to tell about Miss Winthorpe, the woman who lived there. People said she was over 100 years old. Others said she was a ghost. Living in the house next door meant I had heard the whole round of stories, but I didn't believe them. Honestly, I wasn't sure what I believed. At first, I thought that perhaps the house was just empty, abandoned, and that nobody lived there after all. But on the way home from school one day, a few weeks after moving there, I had seen the curtains twitch and a shadow move across them, which meant there was someone living there. The elusive Miss Winthorpe was real after all. About a year after we moved into the house, I discovered more evidence that the place was not empty after all. Sometimes, when the nights were silent and the wind was still, I would hear an eerie wailing coming from next door. I thought that perhaps it was an animal, a fox or a cat rummaging through the dumpster, since sometimes their cries sounded human. But after several nights of hearing those strange guttural cries, I concluded that it wasn't an animal after all, but a person making those sounds. Miss Winthorpe, specifically. I thought that perhaps she was in pain, and that's why she couldn't leave her house. Maybe she was bedridden and couldn't move. But then, whose shadow did I glimpse that one afternoon? And how had she managed to survive this long without leaving her house to buy food? I turned my attention back to the daisy chain in my mind, the gentle white petals curling beneath my touch. Miss Winthorpe and the house she lived in was an enigma that might never be solved. Not unless someone went inside and took a look themselves. I'd seen some kids go up and knock on her door several times, but they never received any answer. Someone had tried to break in once too, but they'd gotten spooked and ran away, claiming the place was possessed by evil spirits. Obviously, that wasn't true, but there was something odd about my neighbor. Between her elusive appearance and the strange moaning cries, there was something not quite right going on. The daisy in my hand snapped when I pressed too hard, my nail severing the stem. With a sigh, I tossed it into the grass and stood up, stretching. When I lifted my gaze to the house next door, I thought just for a moment that I had seen a face staring back at me through the window, old and pale and gaunt. Then I blinked, and there was nothing but swaths of beige curtain, turning yellow with mildew, a trick of the light, nothing more. That night, the roads were quiet and the wind was still. The moment the clock struck 1 a.m., the wailing started. It dragged me out of my dream and into wakefulness, and for a long time I lay awake, staring at the ceiling while listening to those strange cries. I rarely managed to fall back asleep once they started, so instead, I climbed out of bed, tiptoeing across the room to the window. Pulling aside the curtain, I peeked through the gap. There were no lights on in the house next door, but it was illuminated by a pale moonlight, and one of the street lamps further down the road cast shadows across the lawn. Why did I only ever hear her at night? Some of the rumors said she was a vampire who was only active once the sun had set. But I knew that was just ridiculous. Vampires weren't real. Neither were ghosts. As I kept staring across at the house, the curtain began to move in on one of the uppermost windows. Frozen and transfixed, I watched as a pale, bony hand and gripped the thick material and drew it aside. Almost as though she knew I was there, Miss Winthorpe lifted her gaze to meet mine. Like the face I thought I'd glimpsed earlier, there was something old and haggard about her, like a rot was settled in her bones and was eating her from the inside. Her skin was sallow like wax, gouts around her eyes and cheeks. Even in the darkness, I could see the glint of her dark eyes buried beneath folds of pale flesh. With a long, slow smile, she lifted one of those long, bony fingers and pressed it to her lips in a shh motion. I couldn't describe why, but fear gripped me like a cold hand around my heart. Something about her just seemed unnatural. Like the house, there was something dark hanging over her, the shadows deep and the air still. She continued to look at me, her finger curling around her lip until I let go of the curtain and stumbled back, almost tripping over the floorboards in the dark. She had seen me looking. She had revealed herself to me. I did not know what it meant, but when I tried to sleep that night, my dreams were haunted by her face, peering at me from behind the cobwebs and dust, her finger still pressed to the mouth in a gesture of silence. It wasn't until about a week later that a series of events led to the house being investigated, and the truth finally came to light. Paramedics found Miss Winthorpe's body in her bedroom. She was nothing but dust and bones. Reports said she had been dead for years, her body completely decomposed. But if Miss Winthorpe had been dead this whole time, and who had been watching me from the window that night.
My name is Rita. I was halfway through getting my bachelor's degree in psychology and was working part-time as a caregiver at an old folks' home. It was a job that I genuinely loved, even though it was pretty hard. I had to do all the gross stuff like changing bedpans and helping some of the residents clean themselves. But I also got to do a lot of fun stuff too, stuff that really helped me understand what I was learning in my psychology classes. I spent a lot of time talking with the residents and learning about their lives. A lot of them had Alzheimer's or dementia, so I either had to introduce myself every time I met them, or they just assumed that I was one of their granddaughters or something. Overall, it was a wonderful place to work. My only problem was when I had to work the night shift. I had to do that twice a week. I'd clock in at 8 p.m. and work until sunrise. During the night shift, all the residents were asleep, so I didn't get to talk with any of them. I mostly hung out at the front desk to make sure that there were no medical emergencies. Sometimes I'd hear noises from some of the bedrooms, and I'd have to help out the residents if they soiled themselves or had night terrors. That was when the retirement home really felt like a sad place. One night, I was working at the front desk when something strange happened. The shift started off pretty normal. I checked on all the rooms to make sure that the residents were in bed. Everyone seemed fine, except for one resident, Wallace, who was raving about his son Henry trying to steal all his money. Henry wasn't there, of course, so I told him that I'd handle it. This was a pretty minor incident, though, so I didn't think much of it. About an hour later, something much worse happened. I heard a terrible scream coming from one of the bedrooms. I ran over and discovered that the scream was coming from a 95-year-old woman named Doris. Despite her age, Doris was one of the liveliest and most mentally aware residents we had. She never caused any problems. She was the kind of old lady who must have been a total party animal when she was younger. I opened her door and saw that she was already out of bed. She stood next to her window staring into the darkness. I asked her what was wrong, and she said that there was a killer outside. This kind of thing happened a lot. Residents with dementia would often imagine that there was some deadly threat going on, and I'd have to calm them down and tell them I'll handle it. I learned long ago not to argue with them, but to pretend that I believed with what they were saying. I had to do that with most residents, but not Doris. In all my time working there, she never showed a single sign but anything that she was lucid. I guessed that the ravages of time had finally caught up with her. I walked over and gently grabbed her shoulders. "It's okay," I said. "Let's get you back in bed." "But the killer," she said. "He has a ski mask, and he's holding something metal. I think it was a knife." "Oh no," I said. "Let me check." I walked over to the window, and of course, there was no one outside. I saw the empty courtyard and the trees rustling in the wind, but nothing else. No murderers. I tried to tell Doris to go back to sleep, but she refused to get back into bed until I called the police. "Doris, I'm not going to call the police," I told her. She completely freaked out. She grabbed the lamp next to her bed and threw it against the wall. She was a weak old woman, so the lamp didn't break. But it was still a difficult situation, and I was worried that things would escalate. "Okay," I said. "Let's do this. I'll go outside and personally check that no one's out there. And if I find anyone, I'll come back inside and call the police. Deal?" "No, don't go out there," she begged me. "Too late," I said, and left the room. I knew that there was nothing to worry about. I'd walk into the courtyard, make sure that Doris saw me looking around, and then I'd come back in and tell her to go to sleep. No need to call the police over nothing. I left Doris in her room and walked through the lobby towards the front doors. I unlocked them and stepped outside. We didn't have any lights in the courtyard, so I had to use my phone. I walked around the center of the courtyard where I knew Doris would see me through the window. Back when I was inside, coming out here had seemed like such a good idea. Now that I was actually outside, though, I became scared. What if Doris really did see something? It was a windy night and the leaves around me were shaking. I looked all around. "Hello?" I called out. I was getting more and more scared by the second. Then I saw something. It was a sudden movement near the building, a shadow. It was very low to the ground, like a man was crouching down. I gulped. "Hello?" I said again, and walked towards it. The night was really quiet, except for the pounding of my heart. I didn't have any weapons on me, so if I did see a trespasser, I'd have to tell him to leave as confidently as I could, and then I'd run inside and call the police. I looked into the shadows, trying to see the trespasser, when something jumped out of the darkness and dove at me. It took me several seconds to realize that it was just a cat. I felt like a real idiot. Of course there was no one out here. Doris had just imagined it. I started walking back to the front door, sure that everything was going to be okay. But when I reached the door, my heart dropped. I had been locked out. Not only that, someone had pushed chairs and tables against the door. I looked past the chairs to see what was happening inside, and that's when I saw Doris standing in the middle of the lobby, looking straight at me. She waved. I couldn't believe it. She planned this whole thing. She made up a story so that I'd leave the building, and then she locked me out? But why? Then I saw that she was holding a bottle of vodka, and I had my answer. Wallace walked up to her with a handful of pill bottles he'd stolen from the medicine cabinet, and then the other residents started to gather around them. I couldn't be sure, but it looked like every single resident in the facility was ready to have some drunken party while I was locked outside. One of them had even gotten onto the computer at the front desk and started playing rap music off YouTube. I ran around the building, trying to find other entrances that I could use, but it was clear that the residents had planned this for a while. Every single door was blocked. After that, the only thing I could do was call my boss, and she called the police. Thankfully, none of the elderly residents got hurt during their party, but most of them had pretty terrible hangovers the next day. My boss actually fired me after that, and, well, I didn't blame her. I'd made a huge mistake that night, and the next time I suspect someone creeping around outside, I will not go outside to see. I'll just call the police.
"Dad?" David said, his hand outstretched and reaching for mine as he ambled around the card towards me. I felt my heart flutter and a warm sensation pooled around my face. Nothing mattered in the world when I had the luxury of his presence. He loved me. There was no doubt in my heart that I would give up the world for my son. I had made many mistakes in my life, but in that moment, staring into his eyes as I reached my own hands out to reach for his, I sensed fulfillment in its most palpable form. It was in the way that my chest heaved, slacking and contracting with each breath that I took. My lips quivered when I sighed and when I gripped his hand in mine. "Will we have fun at Chuck E. Cheese?" he asked me, without breaking his gaze from the cafeteria complex. I nodded. I thought it was amusing that he was so pleasant with his questions. His young eyes glazed with wonder at the Chuck E. Cheese, reflective and thoughtful. I swallowed quietly. His feet were impatient, and he peeled in front of me even though we both walked together. He pulled, but my hand was an uncompromising snag on his motion. He was just like his mother. I sniffed. I met her a decade ago, and we'd shared the best times of my life. She was quick with most things, and she did not spare time to deliberate over details. I was the opposite. I would check things over to be sure they were perfect. I felt like a stranger in my son's life. In some way, I was. We had divorced for 4 years, and I was only present on certain days as the court papers decided I showed up to care for him with my presence. It was never enough for me, but David made me happy, so I decided it suited us to keep the arrangement instead of a long, unending debacle in court.
Dad, look,
David said, and pulled on my hand, as his other hand pointed at the Charles mascot staring at us from the arcade corner for the cafeteria complex. Its posture was stiff, almost inert, but for the slight cocking movement of its head to the left and back. Blood flooded my numb senses when I finally recovered from the whirling thoughts that ran through my head. My ears opened up to the vibrant noise of the kids playing around the arcade, but in a sense, I felt uneasy about the mascot staring straight at us. It was an oddly captivating sight, seeing a fluffy mouse-like mascot, taller than the average person, but renting itself to the atmosphere. I was not amused. I was disturbed by its grunginess. David burst into a cackle, and it broke the ice in my mind.
I want to go,
David said to me, hinting at the shooting noises that came from the game center. In the moment, I looked downwards at my son and back at the mascot. It had made a turn in our direction. My heart thudded. I realized I had no reason to fear, and my response to this was probably because I did not have too much time to spare with David. David was insistent on the direction that the mascot had stood, and the invitation was easy to identify. The aisle was busy with games, but the mascot troubled me still. "Let's get tickets," I said to David. And for the first time all afternoon, I reached to his hand and pulled him to myself for safety. I allowed him some room, and we walked side by side. I turned around to gaze at the Charles mascot, and it was stiff in its glare, straight at us and unwavering. The saliva in my mouth slipped into my throat, but I continued to walk towards the counter. I sensed frightening whispers in my ears, and for reasons I could not immediately reconcile, I broke a sweat around my face just as I began to arrive at the counter. I just wanted David to have fun at the Chuck E. Cheese. It was the only reason I was there. Just as I stood in the short queue that led up to the counter, a small door opened up, and another Charles mascot came out of the back room, which read boldly, "Restricted." Now, unlike the other Charles mascot, the newer one appeared tidy. I did not have the sense of unease I'd gotten from the former. It was puzzling. And when I turned around to judge with reference, the first Charles mascot had disappeared from its spot. It was gone. My mouth parched quickly. "David?" I searched my side blindly for my son, and the absence struck me so personally that even in the bustle of the complex, I still felt everything fall to silence. "David!" My life flashed before my eyes, and my feet almost buckled from the weight of panic that sluiced through my body. Nothing made sense in that moment, and I felt myself tunneling into a horrifying black hole. I arrived at the arcade aisle, and just to the end of it, I saw the exit door move. The floor before me drifted, and I watched in utter terror as my soul slipped out of my body. I put on a chase, my heart slamming loudly against my chest as I was fainting from the pounding. I knocked over games in my haste, and I pushed the back exit door open, and I was struck dumb on my feet. David held hands with the dirty Charles E. Cheese, and on the other hand, the mascot held a small rope. It felt like a terrible dream, and I shivered to knock myself back into consciousness. There was audible disturbance behind me, but I knew it fell to me to rescue my son, and I raced for it. "David!" I hollered at him. David turned around to look at me, even though he continued walking with the mascot. He grinned at me, and it struck me that despite the knowledge of my presence, there was no urgency in their stride. The blood in my veins ran cold. I caught up with them quickly and knocked the mascot with a swinging strike to the head. The mascot fell to the ground limp, and its mask rolled off. I pulled David away from the wretched, old creature that lay exposed on the floor.
He wanted to go with me,
the man insisted, holding the rope up as though it had its own meaning.
Give the boy to me. He wants to go with me.
Hey, enough! You're under arrest! A broad, white man in a police uniform said to the stranger on the floor in the Charles E. Cheese costume. The staff of the Chuck E. Cheese gathered around me and offered their profuse apology as the police led the criminal away. The excuse was that someone had left the exit open, and the criminal had come in through the door. I wondered what could have happened to my son if I'd been less observant, and the horror had left me so numb that I only wanted to leave with David in peace.